introduction. I'm going to present a contribution about socialist legacies in contemporary Albania. Firstly, I would like to frame this brief contribution I'm going to present to you this morning and underline that what I'm going to present is at its very beginning, since the collecting and analysis phases of published and archival sources is still ongoing. This contribution is part of the research project Materializing Modernity, Socialist and Post-Socialist Rural Legacy in Contemporary Albania, that is currently ongoing at the Institute of Cultural Anthropology and Art Studies in Tirana. The project started in October 2020 and will end in September 2022, and it has received funding from the European Union Horizon 2020 Research Innovation Program under the Marie Curie Action European Standard Individual Fellowships. The project focuses on the socialist rural architecture and landscape and its post-socialist legacy in the Albanian countryside through a multidisciplinary approach crossing ethnographic and architectural research methods. The aim is to explore the impact of communism on rural architecture and territorial planning in the countryside, and the post-socialist transformation and the understanding in general of the Albanian's modernism. My research moves across four main multifold objectives, which are investigating how the communist ideology materialized in the rural, territorial, and its architectural planning. And in this sense, I will target socialist rural development policies and schemes and how they manifested on the existing rural settlements and landscape. Then I will document the post-socialist physical impact on socialist rural legacies and vice versa. In this sense, I will analyze the current condition of a sample of former agricultural cooperatives and state farms settlements and how they relate with the compelling informal post-socialist transformation. Then I will try to develop a reflective and integrated approach to socialist and post-socialist rural landscape. And in this sense, the project will propose a multi-level and interlaced understanding of these legacies, investigating how local communities perceive and experience these spaces inherited from a very recent past and under a continuously changing present. And finally, by producing novel scientific contribution, the project intends to constitute a national and international platform to discuss and place the Albanian case study in the main framework of the European studies on modernist rural landscape and architecture. Due to the need to be recursive in the development of the project, I've structured the research in 5 main complementary work packages. The first work package will foresee the collecting and analysis of historical cartography and of the photo at different scales, the technical and architectural drawings, historic photographs, party state texts and documents, and short propaganda documentaries. Then in the work packages too, I have foreseen to develop GIS projects and WebGIS mapping that will allow the mapping of the permanence of socialist agricultural cooperatives and state farm legacies in the selected rural macro areas. And in this sense, I will try to manage and visualize the qualitative and quantitative data. In VP3, I will document the present condition of this rural legacy, and in this sense, I will carry out ethnographic and anthropological qualitative method during my fieldwork that will start approximately by the middle of June. And during the collecting of this data, I will try to implement also participatory observation and go along method interview. Then in VP4, I will implement visual interpretation, anthropological analysis, and cultural heritage interpretation of the collected qualitative and quantitative data. And being the interpretation and analysis process an ongoing and recursive phase, this work package will cover all the 2 years of the project. And finally, the VP5 will envisage fundamental and strategic managerial activities related to the dissemination, exploitation, and communication of the result at different level. I am applying a research methodology that can be considered as holistic, since it embraces a multidisciplinary approach, which is based on the collection, processing, and critical interpretation of visual data and multiple narratives through the implementation of historical and architectural research method, ethnographic fieldwork activities, and anthropological analysis. And I will use the geographical information system to implement WebGIS projects and on-site mapping of physical evidence through the recording of images, video, and sounds that will allow to obtain a multi-layered documentation of the contemporary rural built environment. I will collect narratives, memories, and voices of people who experienced the socialist rural modernization process and that currently live in the post-socialist context. This raw data will be gathered by means of innovative and classical ethnographic method and participant observation, as I said, and qualitative data will be acquired also through the go-along interview method, which provides the possibility to access to narratives by tracking the sequence of places through the GPS tracking in practical everyday life while interviewing. This contribution is in fact stemming from the historical and archival research that I have started by collecting and consulting published sources at the Scientific Library of the Academy of Albanian Studies and at the National Library of Albania, but of course also on the online scientific publication repositories for what concerns non-Albanian sources. To understand and reconstruct the architectural and urban planning national debate around the socialist urbanization of the Albanian countryside and the modernization processes foreseen by the communist regime, I have considered the articles published in the main scientific journal issued during the regime, but also have paid attention to the dissemination of the regime propaganda concerning the modernization process of the country to the mass, usually carried out and maximized through various informative magazines. At the same time, I have tried to retrace previous study on the modernization processes changing the countryside in Albania during the regime and after its collapse. The collecting and processing of these materials is still ongoing, and while the collection phase should end more or less by the end of May, the consultation and analysis will continue until December 2021. Meanwhile, I have started the consultation of the archival sources at the Ethnographic Archive of my institute, at the Central State Archive, and the Central Technical Constructions Archive, and the Central Film State Archive in Tirana. And the consultation process, of course, is still ongoing and will continue until the end of this year. However, even though the systematic consultation of the published sources and archival materials is still ongoing, what is already clearly emerged from the analysis is that the main legacies of the communist regime are clearly determined by the country's modernization processes developed by the regime under a harsh Stalinist system that has been persistently applied since the very beginning in 1944 to the very end of the regime in 1991. These main legacies are the reclamation of the major marshy areas and their conversion into arable lands, the progressive and total collectivization of the land, the transformation of rivers into sources of hydroelectrical power, the establishment of new rural agricultural centers as focal point for the urbanization of the countryside, and the establishment of new socialist cities associated to the building of industries. I would like to underline that early in the first years after the falling of the dictatorship, a group of geographers, among which Dean Rugg, that in 1994 already identified the need to document the legacy of the communist ideology in the Albanian landscape. There are also a number of Western scholars that traveled in Albania during the very beginning of the regime and after its collapse, reporting that the rapid pace in changing of the landscape. And especially Dean Rugg can be also considered the first that suggested that those legacies were providing, and now I quote Rugg, the evidence of what in theory might be called a socialist landscape. and now I hand the quote. Thus, building upon those very first and preliminary studies, and thanks to the consultation of the sources done until now, I have identified 5 macro areas in the Albanian countryside as main research areas in which potential case studies can be identified in small rural local context. So in this sense, I have identified the reclamation of Malić marshy area in the Korça district, the reclamation of the Muzeće plain in the Fier district, the transformation of the Drin River in the Kukës district in North Albania, the establishment of the new agricultural rural center of Asim Zeneli in Gjirokastra area, and the post-earthquake rural villages reconstruction in Shkodër countryside. In the choice of these villages, I have paid attention also to the existence of previous pioneer ethnographic studies on the agricultural cooperatives and the new Albanian rurality carried out by the ethnographers of the former Institute of Popular Culture. Moreover, in selecting the area has been pivotal also the need of understanding which were the main issues related to the architectural and urban planning debate. It turned out that the main recurrent themes were the standardization and mechanization of the architecture and architectural typologies and details, the need to bridge the distances between the city and the countryside in terms of socio-cultural services, the self-building practice put in place by means of voluntary works, the glorification of the rational essence of the past traditional Albanian architecture, and the purge towards any Western architectural influence. I don't know, okay, sorry. Among the significant landscape transformation action planned and carried out in the aftermath of the liberation by the socialist regime, the reclamation works of the marshy areas were among those that most physically changed the geography of the country. The reclamation of the Malić marshy area was the first major reclamation work carried out by the regime in 1946 and which continued in several successive phases, the first of which ended between the 47 and the 48. Following the reclamation, various agricultural cooperatives and state farms were established in the surrounding areas, as well as the first sugar beet processing state factory, inaugurated in 1951. Among the first agricultural cooperatives to be founded, the one of Rembets village was also among the first considered as the subject of ethnographic studies carried out by the Albanian ethnologist Andromachi Gergi between the 50s and the 60s. The study of the today condition in the rural village of Rembets, together with its surrounding plain landscape, will allow to deepen those previous studies, bridging the past to the present. Alongside the Malić Plains reclamation work, the socialist regime turned also the Muzeće Plain, the largest plain arable area in Albania, into one of the most important agricultural areas of the country, with modern socialist agriculture and livestock cooperative and state farm. Hectares of land were reclaimed from lakes, marshes and swamps and improved into arable fields. As part of the plain called Muzeće Made, the former marshy area known as Fusha e Tërbufit, Fusha e Roskoveci and Fusha e Ojares constitute an example of those reclamation works carried out by the socialist regime for the transformation of the Muzeće plain from malarian swamps into irrigated field. Between 1967 and 1985, the Drin River was deeply transformed into a source of hydroelectrical power. The first hydropower plant was the hydroelectrical power plant of Bau Tedejës and was built in 1967 in correspondence with the Drin River's downstream. Then in 1971, it was the turn of the Drita Partijës hydroelectrical power plant, followed on the upper part of the river, and this hydroelectric power plant with its dam formed the reservoir nowadays called Lake of Fierza. The last hydropower plant, the Enverogge hydropower plant, was built in 1979-1980 in a strategic position in the middle of the first two hydropower plants, and entered in function between 1985 and 1988. Following the construction of those 3 hydropower plants, existing rural villages and the old citadel of Kukës were flooded, submerged by the creation of the new reservoir. As consequence, the party planned to rebuild them as new rural village that, together with the new town of Kukës, were aimed to reflect the socialist urban planning imprint. Then the fourth macro area will focus on the socialist rural center of Asimzeneli, because it is an example of the past nationalistic emphasis that aims to enclose existing rural villages within the state-controlled collective farm and agricultural cooperatives economy, while planning the urbanization of the countryside and the industrialization of the country as a declared and tangible project toward the modernization process. The planned socialist rural center of Asimzeneli is in the Drino Valley, near the historic citadel of Gjirokastra. It has been founded in 1947 as a first breeding collective cooperative in the People's Republic of Albania, and in 1972 evolved into a planned socialist rural center for the near collective villages of Krin, Saracinisht, Trenesisht, Lazarat, Su, Stegopul, and Labove Libohovës. Besides new socialist rural houses, the center hosted an elementary and middle school, a cultural center, and the main commercial and administrative services. It has been among the first agricultural cooperatives to be studied by the Albanian ethnographers in 1960s. And as in many other examples in the countryside, the Asimzeneli Rural Center and its building testify how, despite the socialist ideal inspired by scientific, technological, and cultural progress pushed toward a new Albanian urbanized rurality, de facto, the tension between tradition, nationalism, and modernity shaped a new hybrid and modest rural architecture. Finally, the post-earthquake reconstruction in Shkodra happened after the earthquake of April 15, 1979. And on the 3 October 1979, the reconstruction of the, I'm sorry, I forgot to play. On October 3, 1979, the reconstruction of the rural villages hit by the earthquake was declared complete. Homes, schools, and farms were rebuilt in just over 5 months and a half of reconstruction work, in which groups of people from all over the country took part. The flash post-earthquake reconstruction in Shkodër countryside was another opportunity to reaffirm the new rural modernity reflected in the urbanization of the countryside. Nevertheless, more importantly, it represented the timing opportunity to demonstrate the efficiency of the self-reliant policies adopted by the People's Socialist Republic of Albania in the aftermath of the Sino-Albanian split in 1978.
Federica, 2 minutes.
Yes, I'm finished. And to conclude, sorry, this is not okay. To conclude, as stated at the beginning, this contribution stems from a consultation of published and unpublished sources still ongoing. The general purpose is not to be exhaustive, but to provide a first insights and preliminary consideration about my research topic, while introducing the selected areas of study. By choosing the 5 representative macro areas, my aim is to demonstrate that evidence of the Albanian socialist landscape exists, and traces of that recent modernization process are still present on the territory. Of course, the post-socialist transitional period started to leave its own traces in the early 1990s, at the dawn of the communist collapse. In the very last years of the regime, the government started the decollectivization of the agricultural lands, following the principle of land distribution, denying any prior inheritance rights, a process that during the first year of the post-socialist era took a drastic turn, basing itself on the opposite principle of land restitution. In this context, rural landscape and architecture underwent a further reshaping process that is still ongoing and clearly visible. All this demonstrates the urgent need to document and provide a multi-leveled analysis of the Albanian socialist and post-socialist rural landscape and architecture, setting the basis for further research. Finally, I would also like to underline that the project participates in the Horizon 2020 Open Research Data pilot, which aims to make research data and scientific publication findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So all scientific outputs, and such as scientific publication, webinars, photo album, and digital storytelling, and a short ethnographic documentary that will be produced, together with selected processive dataset, will be stored and made available in Zenodo. And the updates of my research can be accessed via the Cordis website or on the project website, materializingmodernity.com, and the respective social media. Thank you.
Federica, about the interesting presentation about the socialist history in Albania, and it is very connected to other countries in the region. And now we are